types of phenomena that that help create a cycle. Does the method of the initial establishment of a political order, a political system, a form of government matter? Does it even matter? We'll see in a few minutes. I'll give an example when it might not. But in any case, in terms of most of my work, I have always argued that it does. That work comes out of the Central European context very clearly. And you'll see in just a second why. But first, let me try to initially, and in the Hungarian version of this class, I could put my whole scheme on the board. Here I will do it in a very simple way because I don't feel like writing on the board. Turn my back up. I try to analyze forms of change according to two variables. One of them is legality. That's relatively easy. The other one is could have been systemic structure, but I think that's usually the form of legitimacy that actors claim about a regime is at least a key organizing principle of regimes. So legality and legitimacy, two variables, and you can imagine that both can be continuous in the process of change, or they could involve a rupture or a break. So the easiest thing is reform, right? Which means that the principle of legitimacy of the existing order is continuous, and reform also means that changes are accomplished through legality. Another easy case is revolution, where I think all of you can see that we don't really call most things revolution. Well, the ordinary terminology is very loose, but I think at least people who are intellectually serious don't call things revolution if legality is continuous. The assumption of a legal break is there. And of course, with one regime replacing another, it means that there's a break in legitimacy too. So in these variables, using legality and legitimacy, I get reform and revolution as two cases. The problem is, or the advantage is, that you could vary them differently. For example, you could have the same type of regime, the same type of legitimacy achieved through a legal break. That's what a coup is, right? A coup doesn't establish really a new political order in the fundamental sense, or at least if it does so temporarily, but it certainly involves a legal break. And conversely, the things that in Eastern Europe, Central Europe, we eventually call self-limiting revolution, negotiated revolution, regime change, coordinated transition, the term János Kiss uses for this, is one that involves legal continuity, but a change of regime legitimation principle. So you get four systems this way. I've done this since 1990. János Kiss, a Hungarian political philosopher, is the one who began to talk in these terms, but I come up with four types because he only had the three I mentioned. He only had revolution, reform, and regime change. He did not have the coup as the fourth category, but logically, this 2x2 frame, you get four. Now, the thing is that when we develop these schemes, we're all extremely optimistic about democracy. So what are the things that get us to democracy? What are the historical forms that got us to various forms of democracy? So was the question. And of course, the very same changes that one talks about could also be presented in the opposite direction. So, for example, this is the longest history on the level of concepts and terms. Revolution from the very beginning. I suspect that this term, the conceptual opposite, appeared already in the 18th century as counter-revolution. We always had counter-revolution. I don't know if counter-revolution was used in the 17th century, when revolution was used as a cyclical category and not a linear one. It's impossible, and there was no need for counter-revolution in that kind of cyclical view. But from the French Revolution and counter-revolution is a term, it's always discussed. I don't know about Latin America, which would be interesting in this class, because that's one of the places where you get the most revolutions, or the most political orders affected by revolutions. Whereas counter-revolution, a term from the beginning. But the revolution has this counter-revolutionary counterpart. And I think even in the case of coup, Alexander saw this in the literature, I'm sure, there is a view which has been used for Honduras and Peru, as far as I can tell, namely a preservationist coup, a democratic coup. The point of the coup is not to inaugurate an authoritarian order, but to actually restore democracy, which was already threatened. I know that's what I'm talking about. In Peru, this was and remains, even down to this day, probably a significant question and problem. So even for coup, you could imagine, right, a counter coup that, for example, if you actually think about it, there are probably lots of historical examples for it. I think it was July 1944, a couple of months before I was born, that a coup attempted against Hitler. Now, what is that? Is that like most of the coups we know were they headed in an authoritarian direction, or were they trying to restore a constitutional order? Probably they were, and they failed. In any case, coup has its opposite. What about I guess the third category is reform. What about reform? Reform means that you're making changes in a governmental or political order step by step through incremental changes. Reiterated reform sometimes is called. Mexico is the champion of reiterated reform, right? I mean, who knows? You can tell me the date when it begins, and perhaps it still continues through our day, reforming the old pre-type authoritarian system into eventually something else. So that's reform as we ordinarily understand it. Can't it go backwards? Well, that's a category of backslide. That's what backsliding is. In other words, small incremental steps, sometimes linked to other such steps, which reduce the democratic quality of the process, and in the end, the democratic quality of the political form, and could indeed end up with a full authoritarian regime. We used to imagine that reforms can lead to socialism. This was Edward Bernstein's view. Well, maybe some people imagine that backsliding could lead to a fully authoritarian outcome. Certainly, some of the actors would not mind. Well, the question today will be whether the negotiated transition could also have a backward form. Is backsliding is it reverse form, for example? That question I leave open. I'm skeptical, because I think that the contemporary backsliding cases can be pretty well described in terms of the idea of an anti-democratic or undemocratic reform process. Let me begin with revolution, and I'm watching my time very much to be able to get through this whole point. Now, we assign Hannah Arendt on revolution, right? And Hannah Arendt is enthusiastic about the revolutionary processes, and even predicts that for the 20th century, it will remain the dominant form of coming back, of politics making a comeback, genuine politics making a comeback. She's quite enthusiastic about it. Wrote a piece on Hungarian Revolution in 1956, which ended very quickly badly. But she still, in spite of its failure, she continues to think this way. Her theory goes in a different direction, as far as I'm concerned, because her theory of the two revolutions would not make one particularly optimistic about the future of revolutions. What are the two revolutions? Well, if you even looked at the book, you know that the two models are America and France. So the two revolutions both originate in the 18th century. The French Revolution, and she does not, strictly speaking, discover our cycle. But of course, she already knows, right? I mean, think of it. 1789 to 91, constitutional monarchy is established. It's a republican type of political order. This is overthrown in 1792, and by 93, you have 93, 94, you have dictatorship or Committee of Public Safety, which in turn is overthrown in Thermidor, right? And then the Thermidorian system, which is again a kind of republic, authoritarian or oligarchic republic, is itself overthrown by Napoleon. And then Napoleon himself, now he's overthrown not by French internal processes, but he's certainly overthrown by people. And there is a restoration, even the term restoration is used, which is a basically cyclical term, but it's restoration, but restoring a previous arrangement. But the restoration doesn't succeed 1830. Hannah Arendt knows all this. European intellectuals, well-educated ones at least, are totally fascinated, most of them, by the French Revolution from whichever political side. And she's really conscious of it, even of the fact that the Russian revolutionaries taught to follow the French pattern. And Arendt knew very well that even the Russian Revolution from February 1917 to October 17 to January 1918, when the Constituent Assembly is dissolved, and then, of course, eventually Stalinism, the Russian Revolution itself has a kind of internal cycle. So there is one revolutionary tradition, and this is the only revolution that Arendt thinks is that of the French, and she discovers the cycle in the context of it. But simultaneously, she discovers another revolution which does not have a cycle, and that's the American. That's the American. The American establishes a constitutional republic. That constitutional republic is severely challenged in the 19th century, but survives and is restored. There is no moment of authoritarian rule, except perhaps in a wartime emergency. And that same system survives down to Arendt's own day. And this, she thinks, is really one of the possible outcomes of revolution. Why the difference? Well, I'm going to only mention just two simple issues. She claims, on the one hand, that the social question is not raised in the American Revolution, and the social question, which is insoluble, namely how to make people really materially equal citizens of the polity, cannot be done through political means. The French Revolution tries, and that's what leads to its authoritarian outcome. The first one being a popular authoritarian regime, the Sans-Culottes and the Jacobins. So one answer is a social question. The other answer, which I like because this is the field in which I worked much too long now, is the constitutional one. Oh, yeah, sure. Well, if you raise the question of poverty in a country where most people are inevitably poor, and you want the revolutionary process to deal with that, the revolution is going to be saddled with an issue which it almost cannot solve. And the temptation to solve it through authoritarian means will be very great, because different social groups have different interests, there's conflicts, and in the end, if that's what you're trying to do, you will act, as Hannah Arendt said, on behalf of the misery of the poor, the multitude, the poor multitude. That's her argument. I'm not suggesting that I accept this, by the way. So if you're worried that I have just come around to a pretty conservative position just with the help of Arendt, I don't accept this. I think that lots of things can be done on the social question, even in revolutions that don't necessarily turn authoritarian. But that was her view, And the French Revolution and Russian Revolution certainly represent a lot of ammunition for that particular view. I mean, think about who the enemies are, right? The bourgeoisie is understood as the enemy already in the French Revolution. The kulaks, the wealthy peasants who are themselves peasants, become the picture of the enemy in the Russian Revolution. So in a way, a friend-enemy relationship emerges from this context, not from the revolution as much as from its social dimension. You know, I don't know if I just want to make it plausible that one argues this. I don't want to convince you or myself that this is absolutely, that his position is absolutely right. I think she's more right on the other question, the constitutional one. Here, the contract is between, let's put it in terms of people, the Abbé Sieyès and let's say James Madison, right? That's the Arendtian pair. The Abbé Sieyès thinks rightly that in a process like taking place in France in 1788-89, you're going to have to create a new constitution. You're going to have to replace the old absolute monarchy's rule system by a new one. So who is to do it? Who has the right to give the people a constitution? And Sieyès says, his own terminology, who has the right to exercise the constituent power, the pouvoir constituant? What Sieyès' answer, the people themselves. No one else has the right to do something like that. Only the people can give themselves a constitution. And even the US Constitution, which Arendt wants to reinterpret, says we, the people of the United States. So even the US Constitution is made by at least people who rhetorically accept that kind of view. But the people means something else in the two contexts. For Sieyès, it means a unified actor with a single will. A unified actor with a single will. Whereas Arendt thinks that whatever Madison wrote to the Americans, the people are a plurality. It's the different peoples of the small republics of the 13 original states. And they come together through their representatives, but also representing the political structures which exist in the 13 states to produce a convention. And even then, it's a point that I tend to point out, Arendt probably not so clear about it, is that even then, they don't claim that they have the fullness of the pouvoir constituant, because they only make a draft to present to the states. So the 13 states also get to vote on. The assembly is not an embodiment of the one people. It is only a recommender. In a way, Arendt sees this in the tradition of the traditional lawgiver. The traditional lawgiver who is usually not even a citizen of a state, who's imported from abroad, right? We know biblical examples of this. Moses, I guess, in the case of the Israelites, but in the case of Rome, it is, I don't want to say Romulus, who is the supposed author of the rule system. I'm forgetting now his name. It doesn't matter. In any case, lawgivers, Solon, in the case of Athens, would be similar. And the assembly is only that. So it makes a recommendation, and then the plurality gets to vote on. And 3/4 of the plurality have to agree, otherwise, no matter how great Madison, Hamilton, and the rest at the convention were, it is not a constitution. This, I think, she thinks is a difference, because such a system produces legitimacy for a plurality of parties, whereas the French type system produces legitimacy only for the winners. Whoever identifies with the majority of the assembly is the gainer, and everybody else. And look what happens. You have the Vendée, you have other rebellions, the Federalist revolts in France, conflict, and eventually Reign of Terror, which ends conflict, but also ends in a significant republic. That's pretty much her argument. And now, I think that uh, 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 the argument can be supported with respect to the constituent process. I have more reservation with respect to the issue of the social question, but the issue is whether uh, 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 the American case can be treated as a paradigm of revolution, the U.S. American case. We won't discuss all the others, but you guys hopefully will say something about the other Latin American revolutions, including Mexican ones and the ones in Rio de la Plata and all the rest. In any case, if the U.S. version of regime change, paradigmatic revolution, there are people who are right who interpret the U.S. model as a secession. Hannah Arendt's argument was that the U.S. model could work because the small republics, the 13 states, already had organized political entities that could yield something like a considerate and rational will on constitutional matters. Well, those 13 developed those institutions under British imperial rule. So, to the extent that they create a new polity, was that the result of a true revolution in the sense of the French, or was it an example of a secession of a group of states seceding from? I think this question could be asked in the Latin American cases too. But in the U.S. case, where the institutional framework is so continuous from 1776 into the 19th century, the argument that it's just a secession has some validity. And if it is a secession, we can perhaps understand other secessions following it. In my Hungarian class, I talked about India, which is a really interesting case of well-established political structures under British rule. In the 1930s already, the provinces become autonomous with legislatures and developed structures of internal accountability. They too seceded from the British Empire, eventually with the acceptance of the British rulers. They didn't fight for it in the way that the Americans had to fight, but the process perhaps could be understood as similar. And of course, there are other post-colonial cases where this could be the model. I don't want to, pretend that I can address the Latin American issue because there's so many countries, and the changes in the ex-provinces of the Spanish Empire could be quite different in terms of their internal logics. But certainly they too incorporate elements, at least, of what could be called a revolution in the French sense, and what could be called a process of succession and state formation in the American sense. So in this sense, to take the American exception as a model for revolution that Arendt desperately wanted to because of her desire to rehabilitate the notion of revolution after its Soviet deformation is perhaps wrong. Now, I think hers is not obviously the only theory that we can rely on. I assign you Taylor Skocpol's book on states and social revolutions, and I think one can probably see the cyclical aspect if you reconstruct her work. What we on some level need, however, to have is some explanation. And I think it is in her attempt to provide an explanation that Hannah Arendt comes closest to explaining why revolutions are indeed cyclical. I'm not going to repeat what I already said, but the deification of the people and the idea of embodying its will in a single agency is in her explanation responsible. Does any revolution avoid that? That is the question. In other words, the idea of carrying out a revolutionary transformation of an existing regime which has previously socialized the population, is that even possible if it is not in the American, US type context where there's previous political development in spite of the external dimension of domination? Is that at all even possible without a solution like Lenin's? Marx was a revolutionary, but he was never on the border, never even close to playing a role in an actual revolution. And in this sense, if we want to take the model of revolution that he developed seriously, which involves both a radical change in the social dimension, contra Arendt, and a kind of a reconstitution of the political order as a whole, do we have any alternative to it other than in some fundamental way the Leninist form? I mean, Lenin in this sense is perhaps a closer reader of the actual history of the French Revolution. Marx probably was a much greater historian, but Lenin, I think, understood how you do politics ultimately better, and I think he understood also that in the revolution, within the French tradition, without some kind of political elite playing a dominant role, the process really cannot succeed. You certainly see that in all the revolutions Theda Skocpol discusses in her work, and I think we can see it in the Iranian case, which you're going to cover. Some kind of revolutionary vanguard, some kind of entity, agency that both radicalizes people before, carries out the instrumental steps which are needed in a revolutionary transformation, and then figures out how to exercise power. Not every revolutionary moment has that. Obviously, Hungary, 1956, that Hannah Arendt points to, did not have revolutionary vanguard. And I think I would add the February Revolution in Russia did not either. February Revolution in Russia did not either. But you can then say, yes, but these revolutions fail. The Hungarian one, thanks to the Soviet army. The February one, thanks to Lenin and his Bolsheviks, who radically bring down the dual power system that existed in the period between February and October. So you can indeed have a revolutionary type process without such leadership, but can it really succeed? And obviously, Comrade Mao Zedong, Comrade Kim Il-sung, Comrade Khomeini are all examples of that type of leader. And they're not just one person, they are an organization in each of these cases. And before them, even Chiang Kai-shek in China and all the rest, revolutions that do not have that type of political leadership do not succeed. So revolution becomes a fundamental problem. And I think that all the ones that Arendt analyzes are, in a way, traceable back to this. So, two debates. If this is the case, what to do? Что делать was Lenin's question. What is to be done, right? But the socialists debate this question before Lenin. And the one who really initiates the discussion is Edward Bernstein. What is in English called evolutionary socialism, or presuppositions of socialism was the original German title, meaning in English that was not too neat, so they translated evolutionary socialism. The English term is right. Bernstein thought that since revolutions are of the Jacobin type, Jacobin Bolshevik, we could say now, but at that time when he wrote the book, the Bolsheviks were a little faction of the Russian Social Democratic Party, which, by the way, had already a proto-Bernsteinian wing, the Mensheviks. But to avoid the Jacobin moment, you have to develop a different model of transformation. It's kind of amazing that he could find a few texts in Marx which anticipate this, about universal suffrage, about the fact that in some countries you could do it without an insurrection. Marx had a few lines, which usually given in lectures. Engels was much more convinced of this, and Bernstein was the academic secretary, the legal, not academic, the literary secretary of Friedrich Engels. And so he really develops this view, which neither Marx or Engels wanted to really push too much, because they thought that most of the time it would take a violent insurrection of some kind to achieve the result. Even if we did it the British way, Marx said someplace, the counter-revolution would have to be defeated. How would you defeat it? In any case, Bernstein thought that problem could be solved, and it is universal suffrage as the instrument. First, you have to have it. When he wrote, most European countries did not have universal suffrage. So how do you expect socialism to be legislated into power if most of the people who are the sufferers of capitalist society cannot even vote? So first you have to give him the vote. He did not yet raise the question of gender, but obviously an extension of his view would be universal suffrage, men and women both, right? And that was pretty much his view, because he was pretty enlightened on the gender question. So that's the first step. But then, of course, you have to vote for somebody. You need a party that actually has the right message, a party that promises a bloody revolution. Who in their right mind is going to vote for that party? We are for a revolution, violent revolution, because the people will not vote for the right party, but they won't vote for you because you are for a violent revolution. So the very idea of the classical revolution, whether Marxists or Bakunians, is one that turns people off, at least at times of elections. So let's offer them something different. Bernstein is not only developing a theory, he's also developing a way of offering something to the population. And that offer is evolutionary socialism. You vote the Social Democratic Party into power, and it will step by step, remember my concept of reform, it will reform socialism into existence. It will, of course, establish forms of labor protection. It will redistribute to the benefit of the poor. It will create cooperatives. Bernstein was very much a cooperative and workers' control guy. And so the factories, some of them will be taken over by working class constituents. It's not that conservative as the other side would usually paint him. And this was to be the formula, and it may take a while. But if you do well, they'll vote you back into power. Then you'll do it. The most famous antagonist of Bernstein is Rosa Luxemburg. Social reform or the revolution, social reform or revolution, he violently attacks the scheme. Capitalism is too strong. You underestimate what capitalism can do. You'll vote a socialist party into power that will want to take some incremental measures. First of all, will you even win the election? Luxemburg didn't raise this question, but of course, this is indeed a serious question. I mean, money on one side and goodwill or good intentions on the other side. Who wins? But secondly, even if you're in power, they will not let you govern. They will create economic problems for you. They will influence some of your members. They will influence some of your leaders even. And in the end, what you'll get out of it is a reformed version of capitalism. Not good enough, she said. Capitalism is itself a system that ought to be replaced, and this method cannot do it. That's her view. It's kind of interesting that she's not just a critic of Bernstein, she's a critic also of Lenin, because when she saw the Russian Revolution, she didn't think that was the way either. An elite speaking in the name of the people, an elite embodying the people, the populist moment, if you want, and an elite that quashes the results of a free and democratic election because it lost it, is the wrong model. the wrong example. She died that very year when she wrote this essay, and her influence was perhaps another element that entered into the kind of Bernsteinian social democratic political option, because indeed that period gave birth to the most important two socialist options, social democracy and Bolshevik. Bernstein, the progenitor of one, I would say Lenin rather than Luxemburg, the founder of the other. But which one of them was right? Was Bernstein right, or was Luxemburg right in this particular debate? Well, you can say that in terms of the subsequent history, social democracy does develop, achieve some successes, but as it turns out, nowhere challenges the capitalist mode of production in a fundamental way. That was, Luxemburg would say, you see, I was right. On the other side, Bernstein would say, what happens to revolutionary socialism? Well, it's not Luxemburg and the Spartacists, it's Lenin and the Bolsheviks who dominate that tradition. And look what happens there. Lenin may have had his own political cycle and his own democratic moment when he wrote State and Revolution, and even when he inaugurated a new economic policy in the early 20s. But Lenin lost. Indeed, he lost because his famous last struggle, he attempted to stop Stalin, and he did not succeed. And then Stalinism is the outcome. So who is right in that particular debate? And it could be said that even if social democracy does not abolish capitalism, Denmark, Sweden, Norway represent much better, even if somewhat vitiated social models than the countries of East and Central Europe and the Soviet Union. This is certainly what East European oppositionists are going to think. And it is they who raise the question of reform and revolution one more time. And I want to kind of end with that, perhaps with a somewhat pessimistic ending. Now, even the very meaning of reform in Central Europe played a significant role, because from the death of Stalin on, almost every communist party everywhere, Yugoslavia would be the most dramatic, even before the death of Stalin, but Poland, Hungary, to much lesser extent in Czechoslovakia, except for the episode of 1968, there is an attempt to reform the existing version of socialism. The name Dubček will bring this to mind, but I think Gomulka and Imre Nagy in two other places had similar projects. Now, these projects tended to fail. So those who were skeptical with respect to the modality of reform, now in a very different context of the context of Central Europe, were right. Reform makes life a little bit better in these countries. Hungary and Poland are much more pleasant places to live than the unreformed variant in Albania or Bulgaria or Uzbekistan, to pick a ex-Soviet example. So yes, make life better. Reformists made life better. And they did. Did social democracy make life better for Swedes and Norwegians and Danes and Finns? Yes, of course. Yes, they managed to make life better. In this respect, reform succeeds. But in that kind of system, with its repressive aspects, people could not accept that as the final outcome. So you don't come around to a view like Bernstein's in the East European setting if you are a member of the democratic oppositions in the different countries who would not have even arisen had it not been for the reform, right? They never would have been possible under Stalin and the camps and all the rest. But for them, reform was not going to be good enough, even if they owed their existence to it. But they also were not going to be revolutionaries. Adam Michnik is the most famous person but my friend János Kiss on the Hungarian case was also very important. And there are many other figures. I mean, Dubček himself, and so on. You have Havel in the Czech Republic. In almost all the countries, you have important figures, and indeed in Russia too. There are individuals who are trying to organize oppositions, and they certainly were not going to adopt the slogan of revolutionary change, because they lived in societies which already had a revolution of the classical type. Well, strictly speaking, only Russia did, and the rest represented military impositions. But the story, the myth in older places was that it was the communist parties of each of these countries that accomplished the initial regime changes of 1948. And so on. And certainly Yugoslavia, it wasn't the Russians, but it was the Communist Party that played the most important role. And in none of the settings would anybody want to imitate that. And even 1956 in Hungary did not play a positive role, because a failure usually doesn't give too much guidance. So something new had to be invented. That's one of my boxes, right? The box of negotiated transition. That is, the question was, how do you achieve a radical democratic alteration of governments without all the hazards of a revolution? That's the question Adam Michnik asked. He's still alive. That's the question that János Kiss asked, and that's the question that many militants in these movements, Solidarity in Poland, a bunch of small organizations in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Charter 77, and so on, the rest. That's the kind of question they ask themselves. And in the end, it was Poland that developed the option. Why? I think you all know that this is the place under a communist regime that involved the greatest social mobilization. Between 80 and 81, Solidarity, the first Solidarity, generated a very large social movement that brought even the regime to the negotiating table. In the end, martial law, a military coup of a sort, ended that episode. But the experience was not forgotten. And in fact, through the 1980s, Solidarity remained an underground, powerful influence in Polish life. And the idea that we must return to negotiation, because reform is not going to go far enough and revolution will go in the wrong direction, was a common one to almost all the militants of that movement. And we're talking about a lot of men and women who participated in grassroots politics in that sense. You don't have that in any other East European country, but one could be the pioneer. And I didn't think of this in Hungarian class, it's funny, but I'm thinking of it now. Probably without a reform process occurring in the Soviet Union at the same time, this solidarity-based civil society option, as we always called it then, was not going to succeed either, because it was an imperial system. 56, there was a reform attempt, the Soviets brought it down. 68, reform attempt, the Soviets brought it down. What would be the guarantee that if in one small country you do it again in 1980s or 88, that the Soviets won't bring it down? Well, Gorbachev, that's the answer. Something is happening there. So in that sense, and I should have made this point in the Hungarian class, I was a stupid fool, I didn't. But this is what happened. You teach it twice, you do it better the second time. Somehow, two of my boxes are interacting. You got to be careful with varying ideal types, because first of all, none of them ever fully correspond to reality. And secondly, they could also be interacting. And in this case, the Gorbachev, so stupid, Andrew, I didn't say that today in the other class. I mean, this is such a crucial point, that without the Soviet reform, without Gorbachev, he was a kind of great man, I have to say, in retrospect. Without him, it would not have been possible in an imperial outpost like Hungary or Poland to actually go as far as they went. And he explicitly announced that we're not going to intervene this time. He went to Berlin and tell the SED, the German ruling party, not going to do it. So this is, I'm so angry with myself, but this is how it is. You can never think of everything. But anyway, still, the Polish opposition was going much further than Gorbachev even imagined. They were more radical. They had more radical goals. And interesting enough, something that Marx would have loved, and this is coming from the working class, perhaps the only working class movement in history that was ever strictly successful, in the sense that other revolutions, woman from China is not here, but no one would say that Chinese revolution is a revolution of the industrial working class. And the Russian Revolution, too, occurred in a peasant country on the back of soldiers who were peasants. So working class revolution in a pure sense until maybe Hungary in 1956, but much more the Polish Solidarity did not occur. But the working class was not revolutionary in the sense that it was expected by Marx, but very much involved in and supporting this new evolutionary conception. Civil society and the working class, in a way, came together. And that was what the process was about. But it could not have ended that way, because mobilization from below, mobilization of civil society, creation of organizations, alternative publics, still does not touch the political structure. You could write a book like my friend Janusz Kiss wrote, it was called The Social Contract, where you argue that perhaps very small changes on the top would allow for a full development of democratic life below, but that's almost unthinkable. When a top is like that, it's a vanguard party which is in charge of the economy, which has a high level of organization. It's, of course, controlling most of the official publics, the TV and the newspapers. This idea of just doing it from below doesn't work. So the next step was to move from below to the political level. That's what the famous roundtables are about. They come from civil society, the organizations, the structures, the motivations. The leaders themselves are grassroots people, intellectuals and workers mostly. And a lot of them are actual workers. Lech Walesa himself, Piasta, the Polish leaders of Solidarity were themselves manual workers. But intellectuals also play a role. Workers and intellectuals generate an option. And in the end, the negotiations are offered to a regime which no longer really has the security that the Soviet Union would allow another martial law regime like in 1981. So negotiations take place, the transformation occurs. From the outset, it has its critics. From the outset, it has its critics. The critics say that these negotiations are elites making deals with elites. As one Hungarian, very right-wing populist author would say, it's a bargain among reds and pinks, red and pink bargain. It was something that sells out the real revolution that should have taken place and had never has taken place. In a way, the contemporary populist response in Hungary, Poland, and so on picks up a little bit where these earlier critics then left off. But the earlier critics then could not succeed because the transformations achieved by the roundtables were quite radical. And those transformations meant that something like a constitutional democratic regime was inaugurated. But the opposition, those who criticized it, gained one thing. They gained a critical vantage point. Elite bargain, even if it leads to good results, is not legitimate. A red and pink bargain is not legitimate. You can't impose on the whole country a system which only elites had a chance to consider and negotiate over. No matter how much change is achieved, that is not a change. Remember, pouvoir constituant siège, the pouvoir constituant, the constituent power, of a few elites who choose one another in a way because the Communist Party chose those it negotiated with, that's not a legitimate beginning for a new political. And these were not the townships of Hannah Arendt in America that chose representatives to make agreements. No, these were self-chosen groups who were recognized as interlocutors by the Communist parties. So the answer to this was a two-stage process. I've been the theorist of this. I have not managed to convince everybody that the view is right, but it is right nonetheless that the way that this initial Schönheitsfehler, the German would say, how would you say that in English? This initial beauty mark or this initial lack of beauty could be made up. It could be made up by a double process, by a second process, which no longer has the drawback of the first. Some people saw this in Central Europe, but not well enough. I think it became clearest in South Africa that a two-stage process was needed. It was the South Africans who really came to understand that an agreement, it was called the Multi-Party Negotiating Forum of 1993 to 4. Kempton Park is the place in Johannesburg where members of proto-parties, both on the white side and on the African majority side, came together and came up with a transitional agreement. But we have no right to do this in terms of establishing an entirely new regime for South Africa. That was the view of most of the participants at the multi-party negotiating forum. So we need a double process, and that process means that the arrangements we make are only temporary. The constitution we now make is only a provisional one. We need a constitutional structure developed in a second stage, which would be a genuinely democratic stage involving a free election of people who participate in the constitutional assembly. They didn't want to use CS as their constituent for reasons that I have discussed a lot in writing, but I don't want to go into it too much. They wanted to avoid the sovereigntist moment, I think is the point. In any case, it would have to be that kind of body, that kind of election, that kind of participation, and not just an election, but participation in all the communities where the constitutional proposals would be discussed before the proposal is finally made. This was the South African version of the regime change model, my fourth box. Let me end on a pessimistic note. I consider this model of transformation to be normatively superior to revolutionary transformation, and certainly also to reform, which, as the Mexican case will tell you, will last a very, very long time, and where change is very uncertain in any of the historical moments. So I think it's superior to reform, superior to revolution because it does not have the revolution dictatorship as its very likely component. So it's normatively superior. Is it, however, strategically or politically superior or empirically superior? And here you can bring up the fact that Hungary and Poland turned toward authoritarian version of populism in the very recent period. In Hungary from 2010 on, in a Polish case from 2015 on, and even South Africa, which is a kind of model for me with the double two-stage process, has a populist episode. Do you guys know the name Jacob Zuma? He was a big guy. He's a big guy, a real ANC man, African National Congress man. He was he was an assistant or a supporter of Nelson Mandela, who was the George Washington of this South African transformation, if one can, if that is a fair way of depicting him. So Zuma is a real ANC guy, a real legitimate contender who rebels against the neoliberal option, which was put into effect after the death of Mandela by the Mbeki government for 4 or 5 years. More. I don't know if Mbeki had 2 terms or 1. I suspect 2 terms. In any case, that's Jacob Zuma. And what does he do? Well, he first of all carries out or he produces a radically, and to some extent violently, populist rhetoric criticizing the model of regime change. It was an illegitimate bargain with these white oppressors, is what he suggests. Even Mandela is still alive, or toward the last year of his life, when this is suggested. And secondly, he claims that he's going to do something about it through dramatic redistribution and transformation. What he actually does in power, and you see this in populist regimes, is create a clientelistic system which is deeply corrupt in terms of its political structure. There's even a very important Indian family that supports his efforts financially. And it is a regime that perhaps is more intent at backsliding, to use our term, than either the Hungarian or the Polish versions of backsliding were. Zuma really engaged in what South Africans call radical state capture. He takes over all the institutions except one. I will tell you in just a second. He takes over the state control commissions, state investigative commissions. He totally takes over the treasury, which becomes a way that he can actually redistribute money to clients and to corrupt. He himself, for himself, takes millions, but so his supporters also include the Indian millionaires who have supported the act. One institution he does not manage to take over: the courts, the constitutional court. Dramatic lesson for all of us. Hungary, by 2014-15, the courts are gone. Poland, tell me when the courts are gone, but I think that by 2017, they are also dramatically weakened, if not entirely captured. In South Africa, that did not succeed. Why not? Why not? What stood in the way? Well, 2 things stood in the way. My 2 favorite topics. One is, and let me begin backwards, because the more important one comes second, is the courts. The Constitution. South Africans managed not only to have a 2-stage constituent process, but they also produced an exemplary constitution, which makes constitutional change difficult, which makes the courts very powerful, and establishes an appointment structure for the courts that the executive cannot control. In Hungary, it could and did. Poland, eventually, a lot of conflict, but in the end, it also did. And it's not just there. Think about Venezuela. Think about other Latin American countries. The courts have always been a very important place of contention. And the executive, generally with the support of the legislature, manages to win that particular fight. It won that fight in Hungary too, and Poland even, but not in South Africa, because the constitutional structure was very strong. But constitutions are not self-enforcing, right? A constitution cannot defend itself. So the second factor is civil society. For reasons that would require a comparative social history of these contexts, the South African civil society was incredibly well developed in this apartheid period. I mean, after all, the African majority had no other place to be active, to do anything, because they were excluded from the other spheres. Even the reforms of the 1980s produced very minimal inclusion for African population. So civil society is the place. It's in the townships, it's in the tribes, it's in the villages, it's everywhere. It is something that for reasons, sometimes the greater oppression or the most uh, 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 negative regime form produces opportunities. And in that case, those opportunities, and of course, that could not be truly suppressed because the labor force in South Africa depended on black work. And this meant that you could repress maybe unions to some extent, although even they play an important role, but you could not really destroy the autonomy of the immense majority of the population. On the left, we always speak about immense majorities. When South Africa, it was an immense majority. And once Jacob Zuma's regime, in terms of its populist promises, in spite of its populist promises, turned in the direction of corruption, mobilization began to occur on all kinds of levels. It also was the case that in South Africa, the press is not fully taken over in this process of capture. And what the reason for that was, it was probably, again, the courts. See, these things reinforce one another. The courts can play the role they play because there's civil society mobilization behind them. Otherwise, judges and lawyers are not the bravest people in the world. But if there is mobilization, they know that there is support. And then the courts then defend the press. So the attempts to totally take over the press, either to the Gupta, is the name of the Indian family, Gupta money, or to actually arrest and terrorize the journalists, is not going to work and didn't work in South Africa. So these different levels, public sphere, civil society, and the courts reinforce one another. And in the end, Zuma, who uses the ANC as his instrument of state capture, is defeated also within the ANC. In Poland, there was a popular election that defeats, we don't know yet the result, it just happened. In South Africa, it was first a defeat within the ANC, where Cyril Ramaphosa, one of the architects of the negotiated transition, is elected president. And that's the end of the Zuma experiment, though of course it doesn't mean that South Africa is now free and clear. So you can see that the phenomena, and I'm assuming that's pretty clear from this analysis, the phenomena of populist mobilization can actually create grave difficulties also for this model of regime transformation through negotiations and through even two stages as in South Africa. But depending on the model and depending on the condition of the society in place, these efforts can be sometimes defeated, and they are only sometimes successful. We have other cases. I mean, you'll explain how is it that the Bolsonaro gambit has been defeated. I think at some level, you could say that in Brazil, a very significant aspect of the defeat is leadership. Lula is a genuine leader of Brazilian democratization, of popular mobilization, with a real movement behind him. And the fact that he was kept out of political power through various means for a period does not diminish his potential strength. And I'm sure only you can say anything about this, even in terms of personality and his ability to convey this type of leadership. He has some real quality. I don't think that you would associate the Polish turn with Donald Tusk, who is a pretty competent leader and knows how to manage, but certainly it's not a leadership-based mobilization. So it depends on the context. South Africa, though they had a charismatic leader, Nelson Mandela, the defeat of Zuma is not based on Ramaphosa's charisma. It is fundamentally steered, weirdly enough, by grassroots organizations and judges, and also journalists. Grassroots, judges, and journalists. That's context, right? In every single case, you're going to have. I don't know what condition the Brazilian press was in this Bolsonaro period.
Yeah, there was the traditional press owned by private corporations, especially Global, which had a huge formative moment during the military dictatorship, was pretty much forced to be in opposition to Bolsonaro because he invested during his government in this new branch in press by religious leaders. So there was this
Evangelicals.
kind of evangelical. So
Yeah.
there was this kind of rivalry, and so he gained pretty major opposition from the more traditional kind of press.
I mean, this is the thing that I think we have to see, is that in every one of these cases, there is some popular mobilization which allows these things to happen. In the Hungarian case, we talked about the civic circles that Orban helps to create from 2002 on. So there's a civil society aspect to his challenge. In the South African case, Julius Malema, Economic Freedom Fighters, EFF. This is an organization which is attacking Mbeki's neoliberal turn. And they mobilize on behalf of Zuma. Zuma may have had, I don't know, very charismatic guy, doesn't seem like that. But in any case, had some leadership qualities, but it was others who were actually mobilizing on his behalf. He turns against them, as did Orban in the Hungarian case. You instrumentalize these groups, you take away their autonomy. But I think in all these cases, you have some kind of, so populism is not without popular base. It has supports. But on the other hand, populism in government can no longer accept the idea of the doubling of the people. You know, if I'm speaking for the people, who are these people out there demanding things? So that becomes an almost natural conflict in these regimes. And I think in that sense, in South Africa, a civil society based popular movement brings Zuma down, even though he to some extent came from there. That's not a contradiction ultimately. That's part of the logic, but it's also the vulnerability. And the other vulnerability is elections. I mean, the Kaczynskis, well, it's just one Kaczynski, one of them died, unfortunately. Kaczynski and Bolsonaro lost elections. There is support. As you say, there is even media and religious support to some extent, but they lost, which means that the other side can also organize for elections. So in a way, if this type of authoritarian formula does not go all the way, it remains vulnerable, which of course is a clue that they will want to go all the way. I mean, people learn, right, from experience elsewhere. And this means that once you have people like that in power, whether it's Trump or Bolsonaro or Orban, the possibility of an incremental backsliding road, which in the end reaches the threshold of non-democracy, is almost built into the situation. That was certainly the case for Zuma too in South Africa. It stopped too long, but whatever. So up to you. Did you follow the logic of this argument? The logic is that, to some extent, the only formula for radical democratic change in the 19th century was revolution. Revolutions of 1848, several French revolutions, revolutionary politics being organized, the internationals. Revolution is the term, right? And this, in the 20th century, is to some extent compromised. And reform seems to be the dominant, that's the idea of introducing Bernstein into this discussion. Reform seems to be the method, but we know that in lots of settings, reform can't go far enough and doesn't go far enough, and could even be reversed. All the Scandinavian countries had at least partially neoliberal turns. So what I'm advancing is that this is a new method, but that new method is not free of challenges and of possibility of deformation. And what I'm suggesting is that in that context, its links to civil society, its links to constitutionalism represent ways of fighting backsliding processes. Okay, please. Yes.
It's not a question, but
Yeah. Just very loud so I hear you.
yeah, it's kind of a like personal impression, but I feel like the experience by learning, like experience in civil societies, I think the very important thing, and that's why we imagine the cycles. Because like on Hanari, I feel like the U.S. American Revolution, they experienced the capacity to change
Yes.
and to build their own things. Also, what you said in South African case, but while those who had no experience in these things, people only relied on the representative
Right.
democracy. So I feel like cycles is natural, inevitable
Right.
by learning the political, by experiencing the democracy.
You see, but this is how the transitions begin. Now you can tell me, because I don't remember, I should have known because obviously I was reading newspapers at the time. But even in the Korean case, the transition from a form of authoritarianism to competitive democracy may have had civil society movements or organizations, mobilizations, pressures linked to it. So this is universal. I participated in the volume Civil Society in the Soviet Union at the time when the transition has not yet occurred. And it seemed pretty clear that even Soviet Union, especially in Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, they were civil society based challenges, mobilizations. So this seems pretty universal. And one could say that this was even universal for revolutions, because after all, if you think about the French Revolution, right? What precedes the French Revolution? Well, we say, in sort of standard history, the Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment, which looks like Voltaire and Diderot and Rousseau and some intellectuals. But actually, if you study the social history of the period before the French Revolution, Reinhard Koselleck wrote a book called Critique and Crisis, I think it's the English title, where he discusses in detail, and Habermas takes it over from him in his book On the Public Sphere, of the organization of the Enlightenment, clubs, salons, beer hall groups, or in France, not so much beer, but wine drinking bars, where people would congregate and discuss and criticize. And in that sense, the civil society issue is always there before many. I think even reform processes, to some extent, are also driven from below. Sometimes they begin purely on the top, but even then, one could say it's anticipatory, because they fear that it will happen from below. So they take measures from above to make sure that it doesn't really happen in a really dangerous way for the rulers. So civil society-based politics is always relevant. But what happens with the transitions? And I think what I even tried to discuss today was that at the moment of transition, there is a kind of shift to the political level. A shift to the political level, because civil society activism can create counterpowers, can create challenges, can create forms of influence, but it does not change the form. And so there's a shift to political parties, political organizations, and the negotiations take place usually through political organizations of one kind, or even solidarity. When we say solidarity in Poland, it was really the civic committees, so-called political organization, that negotiated the solidarity sign. The movements are not in condition to really negotiate with power holders. It takes people who can represent the desires and the projects. emerging from those movements. So there is a risk in these transitions that civil society will be demobilized. I feel embarrassed because I wrote about this already in 1990. It's a long time, but I think that it is probably part of all these stories. There's a friend of mine, David Oster, wrote a book called End of Solidarity, which is about the demobilization of solidarity movement. It's up to all of you to kind of consider what extent this is true in the context of regime change. I'm sure there's a vibrant civil society in Brazil, even during the Bolsonaro period. But once the change occurs, how vibrant does it remain? And well, some places yes, some places no. The astonishing thing about South Africa is that it remained alive some, much more so than I would say in the Hungarian or even the Polish case. And probably one can explain that on the basis of the very different histories involved. But that's not always the same, not always true to the same extent. So we see these backsliding processes often initiated by authoritarian populists, sometimes even left-wing populists. And one of the things they do is want to demobilize civil society. And sometimes they succeed to much greater extent than other times. Maybe the Zuma project was so crude, and corruption is the kind of thing that makes most people very angry, but it's visible like that, that perhaps that in a way helps to mobilize from below, because all they are doing is stealing rather than redistributing or reconciling. But I'm not sure if that alone is the answer. So different settings where the civil society can come back is a question. But I think it's important, not just, if you think that's what I'm saying, then it isn't right. Not just focus on civil society, because I try to present a triangle of courts, publics, and civil society. Civil society can be repressed. If a regime is oppressive enough, there's no civil society mobilization under Stalin, right? And probably not under Kim Il Jong or, in lots of places around the world. Why not? There should be, you would think, right? But there isn't, because the repression is so effective. But the repression can't be effective if the courts are still in place. And the courts can be defended if newspapers bring attention to the fact that they're under challenge. So these different moments, these different components, and I would not leave out political parties either. The South African case, they were not gone. Yes, Jacob Zuma took over the ANC, but I don't know now the actual makeup of the parliaments in that particular ANC. ANC is almost like a hegemonic party, right? I think since the transition, ANC is the dominant party in the South African framework, but it's not the only one. And because it has South Africa's provinces, it is not equally strong in all the provinces. So you have alternative parties, eventually not just on the right, but also on the left. And so these political parties also feed into the resistance process to the backsliding. So it's not even a triangle, it's a rectangle with four corners. Civil society, parties, public sphere, and what do I say?
Courts.
And courts, yeah, thank you. Courts is the fourth part of that triangle. And I think that the interaction of these dimensions of the triangle, it's a book, if you're interested in South Africa, the book which gives me the details, although it's not theoretically, it's not theoretically very clear and not analytically easy to follow. Enemy of the People, he's the guy, Jacob Zuma, and it's written by Adrian Basson and Pieter du Toit, two people with Dutch names, and I don't know if that in that context means white or black, or perhaps mixed, because that's the influence of Dutch culture. He has a Dutch name too, right? But in any case, it is a very informative book on how the Zuma experiment proceeded and how it was brought down. And I think it's an interesting lesson because, it gives you the parameters. And these parameters certainly don't exist in Hungary anymore. You can't say no independent courts. He dealt with them. Independent political parties, yes, but they are relatively weak and contentious. Parties, yes, so one corner is there. Civil society, probably, although there are a lot of threats against organizations that have international ties. South Africa has all these four corners of the rectangle, and that I think is an advantage in such a context when people want to challenge the backsliding process. It's also probably true that once that thing goes far enough, it becomes more and more difficult to resist it. So the length of the process is not only a question of where is the threshold between democracy, authoritarianism, mixed system, hybrid, whatever, where are the thresholds? That's one kind of question. But the other kind of question related to it is, when is authoritarian type of structure, or even a hybrid one, consolidated? And the more time they have, so Viktor Orban has since 2010, 13 years. On my notes, I have this down. Jacob Zuma. Where do I have it? Jacob Zuma had 9 years, and Kaczynski had 8 years. It actually matters. And to some extent, you can't predict when the challenge will come, which means when there's going to be a significant mobilization, which has supports in different aspects of society. And 13 years, maybe after 13 years, it's not possible. What year was Putin first in power? Trying to figure out.
1998, 9?
What?
Putin.
1999
or 8 or something.
Okay, so that's
Let me check.
so in his case, he's been out of the presidency for a 4-year term, but he was actually dominant even during Medvedev's presidency. So we're talking about, in that case, 24, 25 years. Number of years matter in terms of consolidating whatever it is that would be developed in a backsliding process. And so that's the fear. I just had the person that organizes the class in Hungary for me. We had a discussion. I don't want to say this, publicly, but I was struck by how pessimistic he is. They can't be beaten in an election. Well, Bolsonaro was
By Lula,
by Lula. Okay.
very
So,
special. Yeah.
Yes.
well, we always say, and this is something I say to my Hungarian friends: you can't beat someone with no one.
Yeah.
You can't beat someone with no one, and that means that leadership matters, right? Where is Adam? Adam is the one who always raises this question of charisma, right? Well, I will say it in his place. A charismatic leader like Lula, that helps a lot, right? And I don't think Donald Tusk is a bad guy, and he might reverse a lot of the changes. By the way, it's difficult to reverse these changes. That's an interesting comparative question with Brazil. What happens if someone else comes to power? Lula or Tusk in these two cases, right? Poland and Brazil. What can they do? Well, first of all, what are the limits to what they can do? Now, who's the legislature of Brazil right now? It's not Lula's party.
No, it's very conservative, and actually that's what has taken most of the energy of the government up to now.
That's
to
my
approve
point.
The economic policy.
That's my
for
point.
the first year.
My point is that if in the context of separation of powers could easily happen, that the legislature will not be that of the alternative presidential candidate. And in the Polish case, the courts are in place. The courts are in place. And what happens if Tusk begins to take sort of measures which are on the borderline of constitutionalism against the Kaczynski capture, right? Who will the courts go with? And what can you do about the courts? So this aspect, that the regime, and that's part of the cycle, right? Because the goal of the authoritarians would be not to allow Lula or Tusk govern. That's going to be the goal. Now, they don't necessarily want Bolsonaro back because, you know,
They can't.
and he's an idiot, right? So he's not someone that you would put your faith in when somebody's.
And they're very popular.
But they can find somebody, some other leadership, and in any case, to destabilize. Now, you know, that's what the energy goes into. Of course, Brazil is a very federal country, so you can deal with some of the issues federally, you know, state by state. But in, you know, Poland, that's going to be much more difficult. So this is the next step. But it is something that almost every regime change you face, because you always have a lot of things inherited from the previous system. How do you deal with it? I mean, revolutionaries think that they are the ones who can best deal with it because they just purge, they eliminate wholesale firing of everybody or jailing of lots of people. And think about the great revolutions and the kind of violence and repression that goes into them. But that itself has great costs. So how do you actually get rid of the heritage of this previous authoritarian period without paying the cost? And lots of countries, you know, have gone through this. Spain in the 1970s, Greece, also Latin American countries, you have faced this kind of problem at different times and sometimes repeatedly. But it is a difficulty. But in any case, the first task is to break the authoritarian hegemony at any given moment, and you have to then figure out, after all, good politics are possible. Probably you would say, and this is, you'd have to say to what extent that's possible. You want to break the authoritarian bloc. I'm sure Lula is thinking about that day and night.
He's spending a lot of money on it.
He's spending a lot of time on that, right? Because, you know, these people, some of them, they're not the same. They have different interests. They have different priorities. You kind of figure out how to use some against the other. Now, what do you do with judges if you inherit a whole lot of judges made by authoritarians? Well, first of all, there you have sometimes the example of judges actually turning. For example, I was just reading that Jacob Zuma has appointed a president of the Constitutional Court. And that president abandoned him in the most important case in front of the court, which had to do with a corrupt gift that Zuma received from his Indian family of millions and millions of dollars. And the court, even his appointee, go against it. So with judges, it's a different situation than with deputies in parliament. The deputies, you may have to, you know, give them something in return. The judges, you just have to kind of continue the appeal to their professional sense of honor, which is what Max Weber would think is present. And I don't know if that's true for the Hungarian judges who Fidesz has been able to put in place in the last 13 years. But in any case, that has to be a task because, you know, a constitutional court in Poland can make the life of Tusk impossible. And of course, Congress could make the life of Lula impossible.
Yeah.
So you have to deal with these other branches, and our systems, whether parliamentary or presidential, do have other branches. Anybody?
I actually have
Yeah,
a
sure.
question. On that schema that you proposed to us regarding civil society, parties, public sphere, of course, there appears to be a need as well of some kind of vanguard or a
some kind of,
vanguard, or as you would put it, leadership,
yeah.
right? So,
It would have, well, that's, you know, you already said it yourself, right? That then in Brazil, there was a leader. And when it comes to political parties winning elections, with all the powers that incumbents have, because incumbents can actually help structure the electoral process to some extent. They have influence in the official press, and now with the social media, they can also inhabit social media, and they have a lot of ability, financial, to play a role there. So I think having a leader is pretty important. But this is, you know, I don't like to focus on it because this is something that cannot be produced at will.
Yeah.
Right? So, for example, in Hungary, who would I appoint as the leader of the anti-Orban challenge? Well, it's an interesting example because there is a man. The man is Ferenc Gyurcsány, a very funny Hungarian name, which none of you will be able to pronounce. It Gyurcsány. It's like we have, like Polish a little bit too, we have these double letters, which are the same as anybody learn Russian, you know that Russian has a soft sign, and the Y is the soft sign in Hungarian. So Ferenc Gyurcsány was the leader of first the ex-Socialist Party. He became prime minister, and now he's a leader of of perhaps the biggest oppositional party to Orban's regime. The problem with him is that in 2006, Ferenc Gyurcsány said at a public meeting of his party that it's very difficult to govern because you have to lie from morning till night. And he was recorded by someone whom he trusted, obviously, at the meeting, but who actually was working for Fidesz, and the recording was released. The next step was mass demonstrations against the government. Gyurcsány refused to resign, but in the end, he had to. And now he's a leader of the anti-Orban parties or mobilization. Well, that's a real weakness. To have a bad leader who's tainted by such an episode means, first of all, you usually don't have two leaders. So he's there occupying the space. Another one is not going to enter into it, right? But secondly, he is extremely vulnerable. Viktor Orban, whom I actually know, is a clever guy. Two favorite words of his are Gyurcsány and Soros. Gyurcsány, I just mentioned why, right? I pronounce Soros' name in Hungarian. Soros, I don't know how you say it in English.
Yeah.
But you know who he is, everybody knows, right? He is the Hungarian abroad. He came to the United States even much younger. No, he was about 14. He was actually older than I was, but it was before because he was born before me. So more or less came to the United States, became he's a billionaire actually. And he finances many international NGOs and efforts which have to do with democracy and democratization. He sometimes makes terrible mistakes, but on the whole, I would say he has played a good role. Now, here's the second name that Orban would mention, because he is the foreign capitalist who's intervening into our politics, buying people to actually oppose us. And he's a Jew on top of it, which Orban doesn't say, but every Hungarian who listens knows that this guy is Jewish. Not a practicing Jew, but in any case, he is from a ultimately Jewish background. So Gyurcsány and Soros are the two boogie people, and it makes it very, very difficult in Hungary to actually either try to become a leader of a oppositional bloc, or even to participate in NGOs which are supported by the Open Society Foundation. Well, that's part of the context. It's different everywhere. I'm sure that Kaczynski also talked about Soros in Poland, but I don't think it made too much difference. And in Brazil, it's not a factor. Soros, I doubt that plays a role in Brazilian politics. So depending on the context, these figures will play a role. But you know, Lula was not made for this occasion.
Oh, of course.
He emerged in the context of still the authoritarian regime.
Yes, workers.
And so, yeah, it was a workers' movement, but a democratic one.
Yeah.
In opposition to, one of my favorite students, Leonardo Abruzzer, is very involved with the PT.
Yeah.
And so he already told, when he was a student here many decades ago, I mean, he's now probably an older professor, even in your eyes. He was already talking about the PT and participatory budgeting. Remember that?
Yeah,
So the PT was a creative socialist movement which actually attempted to say something new about how to organize society in the context of a socialist past, which everybody now has doubts about. What could we do instead? Workers' control was almost always the answer of the creative left, but the PT developed this model of participatory budgeting. And as Rich already told me, at that time in Porto Alegre, it was practiced. So actually, it was something on a local level that was. And Lula comes out of that type of experimental left-wing democratic socialism. And and I don't know, I can't tell. I think he is supposed to be very effective in terms of his public performance. And so, but that you can't create. And if you go around the table in the different countries, who are you going to pick? Let's say he's going to election Iran. Would you know a figure in Iran today who actually is not in jail and who's not abroad, who could play this kind of role? Obviously, in a repressive setting, much more difficult. But in the different countries, who is supposed to? I agree with you. It's very helpful when you have that. That's the fifth. Right now we have a pentagon. You're saying let's expand the rectangle to a pentagon, but you can't produce it. And sometimes you have to put up with the fact that the other side has a charismatic leader. I mean, I would say Carlos Menem would be like that, and I think in the Mexican case, well, López Obrador would be certainly a leader like that. So sometimes, this is what Max Weber's concept of charisma and charismatic leadership may be derived from the gift of God, right? Gift of grace. But God is not egalitarian in terms of distributing this particular gift, and does not automatically distribute it to the right person, right? You're lucky in Brazil. And, who knows, because he's also in some respect a problematic individual, and he had to play the game. That's the result. That's what, I don't know about the case, the law case, the details of it, but it landed him in jail. So that was, something that involved, but he came out of that, and he had the gifts to be able to do it. And perhaps having Bolsonaro as his opponent was an advantage too. But this is not something that you have everywhere. And sometimes, this is something interesting. If you're a charismatic figure, and I don't doubt López Obrador has that kind of charisma, the temptation is more the authoritarian one. He agrees. It's more the authoritarian one. Because if I'm like that, and if I have that kind of effect on the crowd, I think Perón might have been like that also. You have that kind of effect, and that's the way it works. Why should I run things by, Habermas and deliberation? Why should I run things by? Why should I really share power with judges and unelected people of all kinds, or even provincial governors? These are López Obrador's problems. In some of the states, you can't control the provincial outcome. And the tendency is, does Lula have such tendencies? It's a problem, because on the one side, you say he has a task which the actual structure of power doesn't favor. But on the other hand, they are dangerous in fact, using this charisma in an authoritarian way. And yeah, I mean, you can do what Nelson Mandela did and walk away. That's extremely noble. But then you get a radical neoliberal reform instead. Then you get Jacob Zuma. So his walking away did not open the terrain to something better. Walking away is not automatically the best answer. Even in the United States, George Washington walking away led to a very repressive period under John Adams. The Alien and Sedition Acts. I don't want to talk too much about US history, but there's a little cycle then between Washington's presidency, Adams's, and then the restoration under Jefferson. And judges were the problem for the first time because Adams was trying to consolidate his power through his midnight appointments of judges. This is US history is really interesting. At some point, if you hang out in the US, would be interesting to read one or two interesting books on it. But I think that this is fascinating because even in that period, which is Hannah Arendt's remarkable creation of a constitutional republic, she doesn't criticize it in any way, as far as I can tell. You have a little mini cycle with people, journalists being arrested, and with authoritarian measures being applied to the oppositional party. And then, even then, in the United States, it was an election which Jefferson won. But that was a funny election because it was not decided in the Electoral College because it was a tie and it had to come to Congress. And then Jefferson won. And then Jefferson begins a kind of redemocratization of the country or republicanization because it was not yet very democratic. But even here, so Hannah Arendt gets this American exception somewhat wrong because even here in the beginning, but in Latin American cases, the Latin American revolutions almost from the beginning are in the danger of coups and other forms of abrogation. So this period of the classical 18th, 19th century revolutions is not automatically in Hannah Arendt's ballpark. In that sense, the French was unfortunately prophetic. The French Revolution is prophetic. And probably you could redo the revolutions of most any Latin American country, the history of any Latin American countries from a point of view of is it more like France or is it more like the United States in the Hannah Arendtian scheme? And I don't know, there are 3 Latin Americans, 4 Latin Americans in a class. Are you French or are you American, your histories? Yes.
Everybody is French.
I would say. Now, maybe there are places like Costa Rica, right, which for some strange reason, which is hard to figure out, it may be that you need a kind of oligarchic democracy to stabilize the Arendtian American model. It was
because I think the problem is the passage for the institutionalization of society, right? The consolidation of this very institutionalization. Because in this scheme, I mean, this is very important. So this seems like it's a continuing bourgeois revolution.
Yeah.
That has this kind of revolutionary aspect within itself, but also the conservative aspect, right? And the revolution, and paradoxically, the revolutionary dimension is successful when it institutionalizes itself. Right. But the conservative side keeps it from getting institutional.
But you know, here Marx against Arendt, right? I mean, of course, her whole book is directed against the Marxist interpretation of revolution. So that's the point. But you know, Marx should be defended, which implicitly you just did, because it means that these things have a class content. As a class content. I mean, I would suspect, I'd love to, I think Perry Anderson wrote a book on Latin American revolutions. So some interpreters of the revolutionary process do write on Latin America. And obviously, you have enormous amount of literature in Spanish and probably Portuguese too on this subject. But I think without really at all an expert or knowing, I think that there is an oligarchy consolidation taking place, which is around, when we say oligarchy, we mean that the possessing classes play a pretty significant role. And so probably in all the Latin American revolutions, you have a popular moment. But to use your word, that moment is not fully institutionalized. It survives in terms of the memories. So the next time around, at the next break of history, it comes out again. So popular mobilization happens, even that's cyclical. But oligarchy consolidation is also cyclical. And then oligarchy and authoritarianism are part of this cycle, because in a way, authoritarians, I mean, I would be, this would be worthy of a story by Borges or somebody who actually writes about that kind of history in a creative way. Oligarchy consolidation allows for would-be authoritarians to mobilize a popular factor. And of course, their misrule allows for oligarchic opposition in the name of constitutionalism, not yet democracy most of the time. So in a way, the cycle which we are dealing with in this class, which I'm very, I'm modernizing it a lot. If you go to the 19th century, may very well be the cycle between oligarchy and authoritarianism, with some popular moments of mobilization in between. And that's what the cycle really looks like. And whether we're doing now Mexican history or Argentinian, Brazil is a very special case, because it is not formally a republic until very late in the 19th century. But still, I suspect that even there, these kinds of issues come up once the monarchy is over. So I think it would be this type of cycle, which is not quite my cycle, between constitutional democracy and authoritarianism, but between oligarchy and authoritarianism. And Marx would understand that well. This is what I'm going to do in my class on Wednesday, all right? Because that's what Marx faced. When you read 18 Brumaire, it's not that Napoleon is overthrowing a genuine constitutional democracy. That was already gone, Marx said. That was already gone. The June days finished that off. In fact, the bourgeoisie abolishes universal suffrage. Wow. Right? What kind of democracy is that? They abolish it. And you know who restores it? Napoleon. Napoleon III restores universal suffrage. That is a fascinating part of this. That maybe sounds very Latin American, that 18 Brumaire story of three factors: popular suffrage, popular mobilization, oligarchy, and authoritarian leadership. And who is with whom in that kind of setting? Because obviously the popular factor turns against Napoleon in 1870. I mean, if you start a war and lose it on the top of it, that's pretty bad from the point of view of your popular legitimacy. But that's the Marxian story, and I try to develop it. It just so happens that I have to do something different from a Hungarian class, but all of you are welcome. And if you can't listen to it on Wednesday, this gentleman here makes sure that you could listen to it. It's not going to be, the greatest gift of scholarship to human beings. I mean, after all, a lot of people have written about this aspect of Marx. It's the most dramatic aspect of Marx.
Yes.
I think that the theory of capitalism is very, very interesting, but in the context of the 20th century, there's so many things happen on that level that it's not easy to continually apply. But unfortunately for us, this model of cycles between, let's say, three dimensions: popular government, oligarchy, and authoritarianism. This is something that is discovered by Marx, and Hannah Arendt doesn't see it, or attributes it only to the French Revolution and to bad ideas at the time of the French Revolution. And Marx gives a class analysis of it. which 19th century still have classes, but if we still have traditional classes or not is an open question. But I think the 19th century, when Marx lived, was clearly one that there are classes in this way, and the fact that he analyzes Bonapartism in class terms was a pretty formidable achievement. And it's not his only one, because he wrote something on the 1848 revolution before, and then the Commune after. So it's 3 historical writings. I need to assign all of them because I'm skeptical about how much people can read in such a short time. But I think I would recommend all those texts. And the 18 Brumaire is in that respect the best. It's the best, and it has something to do with our topic here, maybe a lot. Next semester, I'll try to use some of it in order to give an economic analysis of the cycle, but I'm not quite ready to do that now. Okay, thank you very much. We had a lot of discussion of Brazil, but I think that's good because in terms of backsliding, it's very important